Ben, thank you very much for rejoining me for a second conversation on active inference and probably a bit more meaning crisis this time as well, and technology.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
Powerful combo as well. Obviously your work, like you're an expert in active inference and also the social media stuff, and really one of the pioneers, I think, of applying active inference to digital technology. So yeah, this is obviously a topic that's important for my own research, but I think this is really something we can generate some interesting ideas on. But to start off with, I wanted to ask you, what's your framing of the meaning crisis? Do you accept kind of John Vervaeke's framing? Do you think of it in more of an active inference way? I wanted to.
Well, I should say yes. I'm certainly not an expert on the meaning crisis. This is something that I've come to relatively recently, and I would say, given the fact that I came to the notion of the meaning crisis through John Vervaeke's work, that's the sort of definition that I would lean on. I think I would say that in thinking about a definition of meaning, I mean, I don't want to kind of run away immediately away from the question and off topic, but I would say, like, if there is any departure there, I would say that I would probably consider myself to have a slightly broader conception of meaning than John tends to use. I'm not attributing like a narrow definition to John. It's just that when you read him and hear him speak about the meaning crisis, like, I tend to my inclination is to think that we can maybe work with a slightly broader definition of meaning, or at least bring in different kind of aspects to meaning. I know he talks about 4 main aspects to meaning, but yeah, I mean, when we talk about the meaning crisis, when I think about it or speak about it, I'm basically kind of using John's definition for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of because John's, I suppose, I mean, this is a bit of my own version of his framing, but that it starts with this. We have kind of a Christian Aristotelian worldview that makes sense of people's lives through the medieval times, scientific revolution, that starts to kind of break down. And so there's an issue with our modeling, really, with the generative model that had been used to make sense of people's lives has kind of broken down. And now there's a kind of, I don't know, you'd call it a void. Nietzsche called it the death of God, obviously. And then you get this kind of fragmentation of people's worldviews that is causes even just prediction error, I suppose, of registering as a lot of more negative emotion or volatility, uncertainty. Would you say that's fair enough? It's
that sounds fair enough to me. Yeah, I think one of the key notions is that John talks about. I think they refer to it as agent arena coherence, or the kind of fit between agent and arena, where it was easy to have, there was a given worldview that provided both a model of the world and kind of a world of affordances that modeled kind of right action in a way that meant there was a sense of belonging in the world. You existed in an arena as an agent that provided a kind of sense of significance, purpose, coherence. And so over a fairly long time scale, for various reasons, the kind of apparatus that provided that coherence between agent and arena has been eroded in various ways.
Yeah, that were kind of cultural, orderly thing. But even, I suppose, just the evolution of technology and the rate of change increasing a lot probably since the Industrial Revolution. I mean, people never lived in like the same environment all the time, but there seem to be more stable structures anyway, even in terms of like social structure, maybe smaller populations where you're familiar with people that you knew, and they didn't change as rapidly as things have changed in our lifetime.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think I know listening to John speak about this, there's always he's very careful to make sure that this isn't a kind of nostalgic kind of yearning for the past per se. There's nothing particularly attractive about kind of pre-Black Death England. There's a lot of problems with it, but there is definitely kind of very plausibly, I think, I find it quite convincing, various kind of concomitant streams of change. One that you mentioned one already, which is a kind of various scientific revolutions, and also like the emergence of mathematics as the dominant mode of truth telling about the world, where, mathematics really abstracted from the precedence of subjective first-hand experience. And so
Yeah,
the
and
work,
subjective first-hand experience
yeah,
being less significant, I suppose, than a
yeah,
third-person perspective, an
yeah,
objective.
yeah, for sure. And so you have a world where truth is kind of told through this abstracted mathematical framework that, of course, most people are not fluent in. And so we come to rely on science and mathematics for our understanding of objective reality and truth. And then at the same time, the emergence of various forms of commerce and business, capitalism. I love it when John talks about advertising as being this kind of, this pure hose of bullshit, kind of
Yeah,
bullshit in the technical sense, the kind of Harry
technical
Potter
term, of
technical
course.
bullshit.
Yeah.
Yeah. That resonates with me an awful lot. I think that's very true. And then I think another one that's really relevant to technology, and maybe it's very closely related to what we were saying about science, but also this kind of the tools that we have for maintaining an epistemic grip on our worlds. When you have developments like digital technology and news media that provide, one aspect of this is just purely like the amount of information that's available. I forget the date, but you sometimes hear this kind of factoid thrown around about the last year that it was possible to have read all the books in the world. So at some point we departed from this kind of state where it was kind of feasibly possible to have like a good grip on all of these sources of information, in theory at least, to the point now where obviously we're having conversations around misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theories, and just the ferocious rate at which social media platforms can perpetuate all kinds of things, really.
Yeah, and kind of just break the frame. Like, it's not possible to have, it seems like there's always a new issue coming up. There's a new thing coming down the pipeline that you have to map out. And these are all complex issues that's like, we're just kind of overwhelmed, or that there's too much to really, we don't have the epistemic tools to model all of that volatility. And I suppose like your work on social media platforms have really evolved to present that novelty to keep you coming back, essentially. To prevent it being totally reducible. But this is obviously a broader, transformation based on technology, that we have more access to information, but that creates more volatility.
Yeah,
And
I think there's like a purely kind of epistemic challenge here, which is the amount of information that we have available, and the difficulty, kind of closely related issue, which is the difficulty that we might have in kind of verifying those sources. I mean, it's especially, and kind of another development is AI, generative AI tools as well. Like it's very recently become the case that I can't really tell the difference between AI generated video and real video, which is quite this. I found that quite noteworthy and disturbing when I realized that I couldn't tell the difference. But then, of course, like you say, there is another kind of layered issue, which is how the platforms that feed us that information then gamify our interactions and are engineered in ways that kind of keep us hooked. So, yeah, I think in terms of like the meaning crisis, I think the point about epistemic grip and this kind of information overload on a very basic level is quite relevant.
yeah, and I mean, obviously, like John has this 50 episode, kind of massive like genealogy of the meaning crisis and all that. So like, we're not going to be able to do all of that. But in terms of the problem, because I think this question of being capable of modeling your environment so that you can control it, and that this is connected to your emotional sense of feeling like you have an optimal grip, of feeling like you're actually, you're not overwhelmed by prediction error and negative emotion. And that is because I think meaning, I'd be interested in getting your definition of meaning, because for me, meaning is tracking the expansion of agency. Like, I think about meaning in terms of flow, like Csikszentmihalyi's flow states, which is also the same as the kind of zone of proximal development with Vygotsky, where it's like, if you're at the edge of your capability, optimal amount of uncertainty, you're not bored, you're not anxious, you're expanding your kind of zone of competence. That edge is where you find meaning.
That's an interesting definition. I think what you've described there would sound more to me, it would sound closer to a kind of general subjective well-being. So the sense that I'm doing well, I am skilled, I am capable, I have a grip on my environment in a way that makes me an effective agent. And of course, we know through kind of work in predictive processing and emotion and Mark Miller's work on aerodynamics that this is like a felt relationship with the environment. So when you're reducing prediction error at a kind of a slightly better than expected rate, that feels good. So, and this picture is kind of fleshed out more with Mark's work on kind of metastable dynamics. So it's not just that you have one stream of better than expected prediction error, but it's actually that there's some kind of balance between various different cares and concerns that you're able to flexibly move between, such that you're not fragile in that sense. Because if you only have one kind of effective line of grip on the world, then when that's disrupted through the inevitable kind of capriciousness of the environment, then you're in trouble. But I think meaning for me, and I think for John as well, it's not reducible to subjective well-being. So it's not that they don't track at all, but it's that they come apart in very interesting ways and that one is not reducible to the other. So to steal an example from John, which is a fantastic example, John talks about one of the most meaningful things you can do with your life, which at the same time is one of the most effective ways of nuking your subjective well-being, is to have a baby.
Yeah, totally.
Great example.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think it gets quite complex in terms of like thinking about it in terms of aerodynamics. But I think John talks about meaning in terms of, you have meaning in your life if you have things that you want to continue to exist if you weren't here, and that you have some kind of efficacy in kind of impacting those things.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's an interesting relationship between the two for sure, but it's more interesting, I think, to think about the ways that they come apart.
Yeah, and because that's a really good point, that there's the subjective well-being element, but then there's this kind of broader, more existential. I know I'm familiar with the literature in terms of on the psychology of meaning in life, this idea of that there's the coherence, purpose, and significance. And that coherence is like your life makes sense. Purpose is that you have a goal to pursue, which would be like the positive emotion. And then significance is like being connected to something that's valuable and that's real. John adds.
Connectedness sometimes gets thrown in as a separate kind of, the four of them. Connectedness is,
and belonging as well, I suppose, is another one.
Yeah, for sure. And the relationship, I mean, you would think that typically those things are going to result in like consistent subjective well-being, but I think John's point is that they're not reducible to each other, so they are kind of separate quantities in a way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So like, even if you're getting negative feedback, essentially, like you're exhausted, you have a baby, you're tired, you're up all the time, you don't feel good, there's still something else to it. It's not just the consequence. But I guess there's longer term positive consequences. I know it's like not immediate gratification, but
it's all about timescales. I think in a very broad sense, like way beyond just the bounds of this conversation, I think that it's always critical to think about cognition and affect, well-being, all of these things in terms of like there is a temporal aspect to them. And so maybe that's one of the strengths of the predictive processing framework, is it has this kind of inbuilt capacity to deal with temporal scope, where we're reducing prediction error and fulfilling expectations over, as they say, multiple interlocking timescales. So, and maybe this is where subjective well-being and meaning really come apart in the sense that, if you have a baby, things are going to get really volatile, and there's going to be, I mean, I don't speak from experience, I've not got a kid, but I hear there's a lot of volatility and a lot of violated expectations and a lot of uncertainty, especially for like new parents, right? You have this thing that you care about very deeply and is you probably sense is quite fragile, and you're not quite sure, and you're consulting books and the internet and friends and things, and so it's extremely stressful. And also your ability to maintain good allostatic kind of control in the short term is disrupted because you're not sleeping, your finances are disrupted, maybe there's strain on your relationship, but there is now this thing that you has kind of come to supplant yourself as the most highly precise expectation for consistent organizational structure.
Yeah. That's what, yeah, that's a very cognitive science way of describing the responsibility of a child. But but that is, it's so key because it makes me think of this kind of Peterson adage of his meaning is that responsibility comes from meaning, that it comes from a burden, something that you're actually, saddled with continuing, that's more important than your own kind of
he says,
egocentric
finding the
concerns.
heaviest burden you can bear and then bearing it.
Yes. Which kind of is dopaminergic in a sense, because obviously it's the happiness of pursuit rather than the actual grasping of reward. I don't know. Do you think there's because on some level meaning has to be, it is connected to positive affect, but not just, consumatory reward.
Well, I think this is really interesting, and I should say, I maybe should have said this at the beginning, but so my work on technology and predictive processing really began in subjective well-being, and so the work I did on social media was very much, well-being there was kind of defined as the absence of psychopathology, which is a very basic notion. I think it's right. Obviously, it's better to be free of psychopathology than not. But then there's this question about, well, okay, even if you're free of, you're avoiding depression and anxiety and addiction, what does it mean to kind of what does a positive account of well-being look like? And it's only toward the end of my project here at Sussex, right now, kind of as we speak, that I've started really thinking about what I would call kind of philosophically weightier notions like wisdom, meaning, connectedness, all of these sub kind of categories. And the relationship between them is kind of unclear to me. I think they get confused an awful lot. And there is this question of do they come apart entirely? Or is it necessarily the case that pursuing something meaningful is on a long enough time scale going to guarantee you some measure of subjective well-being? My instinct there is to say there probably isn't a necessary connection. I think we can probably think of examples of meaningful pursuits, and it depends what you count as subjective well-being. I mean, you might be in a constant state of stress and anxiety and feel terrible and never actually feel happy, but there's a sense of satisfaction or something kind of analogous with training, physical training in the gym or in a sports setting where, the satisfaction people, I do some work. Sorry, I'm going to go off on a tangent now. You can feel free to stop me, but I've done some work in philosophy of sport as well. So I'm interested in the philosophy of combat sports particularly. And some of the work I've done with my co-author, Alexander Foe, outrageously talented analytic philosopher, we've kind of thought about the value of dangerous sports and the value of violent sports and whether they can be morally justified, specifically mixed martial arts, where these pursuits are violent, they're painful, they're unpleasant, they're aesthetically, they can be very beautiful. Martial arts can be very beautiful, but also mixed martial arts specifically can be very ugly. And there's a question of why do people do this? What are people getting out of this? What's the value? How do you justify, what is the payoff? Kind of, how do you circumvent the moral concerns? And I think there's these things kind of sit alongside each other.
Yeah, and I've fought in not mixed martial arts, but in Thai boxing and boxing.
Oh, right.
I have a black belt in Bujinkan and Jiu-Jitsu as well. So I've been boxing since I was 8, actually. So I had my first fight when I was 10, and but learned a huge amount from like fighting sports and from
Yes.
boxing
Yeah.
in a way. But then also, I suppose, see the other side of fighting, which is that you can get caught up in just the fighting. Like that's the thing in martial arts. The coach always would have drilled into me is like, there's a bigger meta game. You know, if you overcommit to the local game of just the fighting, you come out the other side, you're broken up, you're injured, you're angry, maybe you're drinking all the time to forget about it. Whereas, you know, like I don't know, Conor McGregor may optimize for the local game too much. Because there's a broader, and the broader meta game, I think, is the virtues question. Like it is, because you're talking about a good life, really. And I think there is that warrior-like aspect. Like a good life could just be winning all of the time in these different games. But there's other games like relationships, family, you know, state, whatever it is, that I need to be in alignment with it. So I think that well-being, I definitely think it's more than subjective well-being, and I think it's connected to some idea of the good life, which does get us into philosophy and into some sort of positive account of what it means to live a good life and a
I think
bad
we need to
life.
be aware, like well-being is means that, you know, you can construe it in different ways, and I think for a lot of people, well-being is kind of, it overlaps heavily with living a meaningful life. I think we have to be quite strict about when we're talking about subjective well-being. We really are talking about like feeling good.
Yes, yeah. Which I probably wouldn't have been strict enough on that, to be honest, but you're totally correct.
So, I mean, and that's fine. Like, I mean, it's not. I'm not. You know, I don't think we should be kind of like too dictatorial about what these things mean. But it's for the purposes of like this specific conversation about, you know, meaning, well-being. Like, there is this thing which just is, how good do you feel? How good is your mood on a day-to-day basis? You know, like, you know, I could have plausibly gone through my entire PhD in a terrible mood, constant state of anxiety, never enjoyed a second of it, and yet kind of persevered with it precisely because I found it to be something that provided me with meaning. You know, I could say that I would want this kind of research to carry on, even if I wasn't here. I would want somebody to be doing it, and I think it's valuable beyond my own kind of prestige and career. And it just so happens that I'm fortunate enough to have a high degree of control over the direction it takes, and so that provides something very meaningful for me. But it could simultaneously be horrible the whole time.
Yeah, and that's why I don't like, I mean, utilitarian ethics really, or consequent, like, because it is like oftentimes the most meaningful things are the hardest things that we do. So like they don't have that immediate, you know, like under that kind of subjective well-being, like if you were just an addict the whole time, like just propping up positive emotion, like in a kind of Brave New World way, it's like, that'd be fine if there's no, you know, if you can just escape the consequences of it. So I definitely don't,
I agree. It goes back to I like this rather sort of fragile, tenuous analogy with mixed martial arts. I think there's there's some good stuff in there, which is, like you say, kind of, if your attitude is one of just training to win fights, then there's a sense in which you're kind of doing the right thing in a way. That's what you're supposed to be doing as a competitor, but that doesn't answer the why question satisfactorily of like, why do so many people put themselves through something that is like really dangerous and difficult and horrible. And I think the answer to that, specifically with martial arts, competitive martial arts, and this is maybe doesn't transfer as well to general questions about meaning, but I think that the arena of competitive combat sports provides a crucible for testing high-level self priors in the self model that one rarely gets a chance to test.
That's what they say about boxing. The ring is a truth-telling machine. It's like everything you did, everything you don't do is going to be found out.
I think that's true. Yeah, I remember having a conversation with one of my fellow researchers here at Sussex, Axel Constant. I'm sure you're familiar with Axel's work on active inference.
Yeah, totally.
And having a conversation about this, and Axel spoke to me about he'd always wondered if he was courageous. Like he'd always wondered, like, you know, he'd always thought of himself as probably quite brave, but always wondered, you know, when the chips are down, would he act in accordance with this kind of notion of himself that he had? And he described having a dream where he was in a train crash and people were injured, and in the dream he was like re-entering the train to kind of drag people out and save them. And he woke up and was like, Yeah, like
Yeah, nice.
I kind of believe it now, and I think like there's something similar going on with combat sports and dangerous sports in general.
For
It's like
sure.
in our day to
Yeah.
day life, we just don't have. I get the train to campus, and it's all very leafy, and
Yeah.
everybody's very friendly, and like it's all very safe, and it's like I am just probably going to go through my life and never really get to stress test certain aspects of my self model. And so I think we are epistemic explorers. We are we
Mm.
we 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 push the limits of certainty, and we explore new areas, and we want to test those expectations. And I think that for those of us that want to really kind of test those expectations, we've created these kind of cultural social artifacts that allow us to do that.
Yeah, like a trial or initiation almost, which sometimes
Yeah.
in terms of like meaning, people talk about that part of the meaning crisis is not having these rituals and initiations whereby you can actually verify if you are, correct.
Yeah.
If you are that age and you're capable of taking on the challenge. Because I suppose with an initiation as well, it's such a big problem that it helps you contextualize problems in general. Like it's like if I face that, a lot of other stuff is small potatoes in a sense. It kind
Yeah.
of gives you this, you know, yeah, it sounds not just in that arena, but in other areas as well. But another point on the martial arts thing, because what you're talking about in the warrior aspect is the martial side of it, but then there's also the art, and the art
Yeah.
is the art of self cultivation that goes along with it.
Yeah.
Like MMA doesn't really have that because it's a competitive sport in a sense,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
cool. I mean, you end up with very good martial abilities, but then it doesn't fix your self destructive habits, your this kind of way of life of learning of self cultivation that you can get from other
Yeah.
martial arts that have a bit of that. Then you get like karate that's become just this like wax on, wax off. Everybody's talking shit. It's a McDojo, and then you end up with the opposite end of that, or you can get a good karate gym. I mean, that's a bad example, but a martial arts gym that's not focused on the warrior aspect. And so it's almost like there's these two arts at play there, where there's a martial side to it, but then there's also the self cultivation.
I think you're talking about something that has featured in the work that I've done on MMA, and I think about a lot. I don't want to turn this into like an MMA podcast, but
Uh-huh.
I think it's why we like it when athletes come along that do embody like a higher vision for competitive combat sports, because it's one of the reasons that mixed martial arts in particular is philosophically very interesting, is because there's like this huge scope, this huge arena for kind of character and virtue. But yeah, I know it's interesting because I think John is a traditional martial artist, and I've heard
Yeah,
John talk about like the dojo as a setting for kind of ritual and ritualized practices, and
yeah,
this sense of connectedness and belonging. And yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that. And I would,
Mhm.
as somebody that has practiced kind of mixed martial arts as an amateur, and really I think that the competitive aspect is very important. I am very,
yeah,
very keen to see those things transposed into mixed martial arts. I don't like, um, yeah, I mean, well, I don't like the kind of what I would say are the kind of baser kind of manifestations of mixed martial arts, where it just is this kind of arena of violence, and there's a kind of the just bleed mentality that you get with
yeah. Which works for a time until you have a CTE, and then you
yeah,
die
which is
prematurely. And
a whole other kind of whole other area to explore.
yeah, but I suppose, yeah, not to get off topic, the interesting thing about this is because like a lot of ancient philosophy, I'm doing a course on Plato's Republic at the moment with undergrads, and like he builds this whole like educational program for the guardians of the city that's based on like physical martial training, but then also
Yeah,
on music and poetry and philosophy as these
yeah,
kind of almost like two sides of the good life that you need in order to become, I suppose, I don't know what you call it, like it's almost like training for the good life in some sense, training your cognitive systems, your affective systems, like this ability to that we need some kind of institution for this type of training. Because like I know John talks about the meaning crisis as like a kind of crisis of not having these rituals and institutions anymore that we used to have
yeah,
that kind of brought us along. Um,
yeah.
and so yeah, I'm interested in the like cognitive science of that. I mean, do you think do you see that developmentally in active inference? I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but is that part of the meaning crisis, do you think?
Yeah, I do. I think that's precisely what John's talking about. I think we've taken, so there's a lot in there. I mean, in terms of, I think what you're talking about there in terms of like training in various aspects, we're talking about cultivating various kind of character traits. You might
John's ecology of practices, he calls it,
okay, yeah,
in order to get this kind of optimal grip. But it's like he talks about it as a counterpoise as well. He has different exercises and practices from like meditation to dialogue. For him, it's martial arts as well. It's different that to help, I suppose, your optimal gripping across different arenas, maybe.
Yeah, I think essentially cultivating like a broad, diverse array of skills that are going to allow you to deal with volatility more effectively. I suppose it connects to the stuff we were talking about with multi-stable, metastable dynamics. This is a very like bottom-up kind of cognitive sciencey, computational kind of account of the value of that. Is you want to be as flexible and competent in different areas as you can possibly be, because that way you're less likely to encounter a field of affordances which is going to result in unmanageable prediction error. But then there's just the value of kind of being a well-rounded, if you've never tested yourself in these arenas, then you know less about yourself. I think that's true.
Because that bringing in the aspect of affordances, I mean, because that's John's solution anyways, the ecology of practices in terms of, and I think a lot of that is kind of the recommendation a lot of the time is the need for this kind of different flow across different domains, but that builds a general kind of ability to handle uncertainty that just isn't really in the current educational model, that's very propositional and kind of lacks maybe these other aspects for people.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's an interesting connection there with some work that I did with the Xscape people here at Sussex, Andy's project. It was a project led by Laura Di Paolo, where we used active inference to kind of look at, assess and investigate the differences between standard mainstream educational practices and the Montessori method. Not sure how
I've read some of that actually.
Montessori.
I read some of your paper.
Laura's an expert on this, and it was very interesting to look at the importance of various aspects of Montessori education, which are collaboration, exploration, a willingness to regularly, consistently confront error and mistakes, and how children are trained to respond to that affectively. And also the role kind of mastery of familiar material scaffolds plays. So in the Montessori method, like very young children are given kind of like miniature versions of like everyday items. So they do their own washing up, they can take care of plants, and they've got all of the like miniature plates and cups and things, and they work together in groups. And whereas in kind of mainstream schooling, like you say, it's very much more kind of propositional, like learning and reciting facts. This isn't like, it's not like a super kind of binary, like there's some crossover. But generally speaking, like in Montessori as well, there's no like sit down written standardized testing, which one of these really interesting aspects of this is there's a neuroscientist called Solange Devereaux, believe, who has done some work looking at the way that Montessori educated people respond emotionally to mistakes. And what she found was that children kind of educated in the Montessori school system do not have like an overwhelmingly negative response to mistakes, whereas people educated in kind of mainstream systems do. And obviously we should be quite careful about what conclusions we draw from that. But, it seems plausible to think that we scaffold those affective responses through the particular learning systems that we have. So if you have people, if you say to kids, I remember being a kid and constantly having these 2-hour written exams and like cognitive ability tests. And we were constantly told, like if you fail this, your life's over.
Yeah, it's very
So it's
numerical
not,
as well in a sense of
yeah, it's hard and completely false as well. I did terribly at my GCSEs and
yeah. And
never
you've done a PhD, you know.
it's completely false. And it's, I think when we're talking about these, like the well-roundedness and the willingness to kind of put ourselves through these,
Mhm.
these arenas where failure is at some point very likely, but it's also collaborative. And I think that there is some, it touches with this Montessori stuff where you see children and adults who seem to experience failure in a different way. Like they seem
Yes.
to be like more capable emotionally. They seem to be, I don't want to say they're more capable of dealing with failure. That's maybe a bit strong, but they
Mhm.
seem less perturbed by it actively.
Yes, and that's a kind of attitude that you can cultivate from your education
Yeah.
if it's done properly. There's an interest that's really, I need to research that Montessori more. I don't really know a huge amount about it, to be honest, but there's something very interesting in that in terms of this imaginative play. I know Mark's done some work
Mm.
on play as well, and
Yeah.
almost like that behavioral scripts. I've been reading a lot about behavioral scripts lately. I'm very interested in this idea that almost like you learn almost dramatically in a sense of mapping out a space, that you learn what an object is, how it fits in, like the example of like miniature cups and plates, that they'd learn how to wash dishes and play that way, and then that prepares you dramatically for when you actually encounter dishes and a sink, that it's less of a
Yeah. In fact,
complete
it's
incline.
interesting you bring up play because we're going on some really good tangents here, but one of the kind of sticking points in the Montessori stuff is, and again, Laura is the expert here, but as I understand it, Montessori herself was quite explicit in that play had no place in her classrooms. So this
Really?
idea of like imaginative, like where you dress up as princesses and
Hmm.
pretend you're a dinosaur, all of this stuff, playing with toys, like
Yeah.
there's none of that in Montessori classrooms, as I
Okay.
understand it. Everything is
Mm.
kind of like focused on tasks that you are going to do in the real world. But I remember
Hmm.
speaking to Laura about this and reading this, and then thinking of Mark's work and Mark Anderson's work on play, and thinking that this is just a false dichotomy. Like these kids, this is play, because this is essentially,
Yeah.
you know, I forget the specific definition in Mark's work with Mark Anderson, but what's happening in these Montessori classrooms is essentially the role of the teacher is to provide a safe environment for kids to explore the limits of their own skill capabilities in ways that feel good, right? They're
Mm.
pushing the limits and finding out what they're actually capable of. And this is one of the key themes in the paper, was how this is materially scaffolded. So if you look at some of like the Montessori classrooms have very specific teaching materials, they're called.
Okay.
And so, for example, if you're trying to teach kids mathematics, kind of broadly speaking, the children start with very material, very physical resources, materials. And then as they progress and they get older, the level of abstraction increases. So the kids are kind of more able to deal with like abstract concepts.
Yes.
So I think play in a sort of predictive processing terms, where you're talking about just kind of in a very safe, rather kind of rather pointless kind of like way, just playing with prediction error. You're just kind of using material cultural scaffolding to give children a place where they can make mistakes, get things wrong. They're pretending that they're doing certain things. So yeah.
Yes. And yeah, reducing error in a way that's not going to be catastrophic, I
Yeah.
suppose. Like they're
Yeah.
not going to, it's a safe environment for them to practice, so they're not going to, die or hurt themselves or any
Yeah.
kind of,
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
the really negative consequences are limited by the environment. And so, yeah, I mean, it seems like we need, because like I do think the meaning crisis is a kind of developmental crisis as well. It's like a
Yeah.
deficit of these skills that can get you to that meaningful edge. Or, I mean, yeah, depending on how you're looking at it, but at least to experience meaning, the felt sense of it, does seem to require some commitment to responsibilities. But that there needs to be some sort of training of this particular skill set.
Yeah, I'm interested. It's interesting you said there, the kind of like felt sense of meaning, because I've thought about that quite a lot and what that means and
Yeah.
whether we kind of, what does it mean to feel meaning? But
I think for martial arts, for me, is the perfect example of like, I can get into a flow state doing
yeah.
martial arts like that. Like, I throw a few shadow punches and I'm in. Like, I'm already, I'm there. I'm moving around. I'm bouncing.
Yeah.
I'm in the kitchen doing it. It feels good.
I'm the
You
same.
know.
I don't
Yeah. Yeah.
not anymore, but I do weight train, and I find that this, I suppose at the beginning I said my instinct is to have a slightly looser definition
Mhm.
of meaning than John tends to work with, at least in like his talks and lectures. And I think like the one area this comes up is in physical training. It's like weight
Mhm.
training feels kind of inherently meaningful, but in a way that is at least prima facie difficult to different to kind of the things John tends to talk about, like sort of like
Mhm.
projects of like relationships and children and sort
Yeah.
of shared ritualistic spiritual practices. I mean, I guess it does fit in a way, but also I tend to
Mhm.
think like aesthetic experiences as being
Yeah.
inherently meaningful, like engagement with beauty, art, the sublime, nature, these kinds of things. And again, I think they come apart from subjective well-being. I guess the question really is like, what role can technology play in this?
For sure. Which is what I'm kind of thinking of with this
Yeah,
institutional idea of like what kind of intervention, because obviously you do a lot of work on ambient smart environments and that's relevant to mental health and well-being. And I guess meaning ties into that as well. Like that, you know, the metacognitive affordances of the smart environments could help you get to that kind of edge,
yeah, I think
whatever
that's
it is.
really interesting. I think there's like multiple areas of contact. I suppose so. So to start with a preprint that is still unpublished, there's some work I did with Inej Hippolito on ambient smart environments in classrooms, specifically designed to support children with autism or other neurodivergent kind of needs, a specific
Mhm.
kind of unique style of cognitive engagement with an environment where, and it comes back full circle. I mean, we were talking about the agent arena coherence that John talks about, right? So
Yeah.
fundamentally the root of the meaning crisis is that we've kind of lost that coherence and we're in arenas that don't provide kind of any grounds for kind of purpose and significance and connectedness. And like, again, a really nice example is just like the amount of meaningless advertising bullshit that's around where people we're constantly deafened by signals from entities that do not care about the truth or usefulness of anything that they're saying, right? They're just trying to get you to buy stuff. And I think that this really comes out in the work I did with Inej, where I think the suffering that children with neurodivergent conditions experience is a result of this breakdown of agent arena coherence, where standard classroom setups, the expectations that come with standard classroom setups, are simply not coherent with their style of grip on the environment. And so in the paper, we talked about the ways that this kind of technology could be used to facilitate a more coherent relationship between neurodivergent styles of kind of grip and educational settings. So I think you can definitely in a kind of broad sense think of adaptive environments in terms of coherence. And again, like you hit this kind of root problem of it has that potential, but obviously we need to make sure that this is what actually happens, because also adaptive environments could just be used to facilitate hyper targeted advertising, which is
Which we already have going on, Yeah. That's what they're using it for.
yeah. But there's other kind of aspects of technology as well. Like I think one thing that I wanted to talk about last time on the podcast that I don't think we really got into it was
Yeah.
the capacity of adaptive kind of ambient technology to introduce more uncertainty into the environment rather than less.
Yes.
Maybe we touched on this a little bit, but this really speaks to what we were saying about the potential disconnect between subjective well-being and meaning, where,
Mhm.
we know very well from Mark and Julian's work on happiness and addiction and all of these things that we can get stuck in these very suboptimal routines. Mark and Julian call them bad boots, and Eric Rieveld as well call them bad bootstraps. And in my work with Inez that was published, preventative mental health care approach for ambient smart environments, sometimes like these very like ingrained patterns of behavior, these habitual routines can be really actually over the long term be quite bad for us. Okay, they might be like in the short term, they might be good for our subjective well-being, but they're actually quite bad for us. And it can be really hard to break these. So like addiction is like a prime example. So addiction is basically like, if you take this inactive view, it's this certain form of agent environment dynamic where this kind of behavioral loop becomes stuck, and breaking that is like famously difficult. And so I think adaptive technology can play a really key role here, which is more analogous to, I know Inez has done work with Robert Carhart Harris and Jonas Mago on the role of psychedelics, where the therapeutic role of psychedelics is to disrupt heavy ingrained attractor patterns in neural activity. And so I think there's something analogous here, where rather than just like brain activity, we're talking about agent environment activity. And actually, if you have an environment that is deliberately trying to disrupt these kind of suboptimal habitual patterns of behavior, there's a real potential for that to support meaningful practices as well.
Yes, exactly. There's so many things there to jump on, but like that idea of, I've heard Mark talk about it with psychedelics, where it's like heating up your cognition so it gets a bit gooey, and then you can cool it down into a different shape than it was before almost.
Yeah, there's different kind of analogies here, like so heating up, the idea, if you think about a blacksmith trying to shape metal, like if you've got a lump of metal in a bad shape and you want to make it something beautiful, like you have to heat it up. You can't just you can't push it into shape when it's cold. And the heating up here is essentially like a metaphorical term for the flattening of probability distributions in the generative.
Hey, maybe go into that a little bit more.
Yeah.
How would that work?
So if you have like very strong expectations, then
Yes,
we know from active inference that you're more likely to enact those expectations. But what you want to do is in flattening those probability distributions, you essentially open up kind of likelihood of diversity of outcome.
So is that like you have almost like unconscious high priors or hyper priors that become
you have
available again, that you can kind of renegotiate them
in the generative model that are kind of weighted very highly. So you have like particularly in your self model, right? So you might have expectations. If you are an anxious, depressed person, you might have like, I'm kind of useless. I have no friends. Like going outside makes me anxious. I do badly in social situations, and they could have like very high probability weightings, right? So they could be sort of like 0.8, 0.9. Like you're very unlikely. Those are very strong priors, and so the evidence required to update those beliefs is like the standard is super high, right? You're very unlikely to be able to sample the world in such a way that you're going to update and change those beliefs, because the priors are so strong.
Yes.
But if you can find a way to flatten those distributions and kind of turn down those priors, then the evidential, I don't know, I'm probably using the wrong technical language here, I'm kind of brushing up against my technical expertise, but like the evidential bound required to update those beliefs is lowered. So this is why, Inej talks about, and Adam Safran as well, I should say. I mean, there's lots of people doing work on this. I don't want to kind of not give credit where it's due. But so when we talk about psychedelics as heating up the generative model, we're essentially talking about the flattening of those probabilities and turning down those priors. But then you have this importance of like set and setting and kind of what evidence are you feeding to this generative model while it's in this heated state? Adam Safran has this wonderful kind of image that I've heard him use where he says it's it's no good blasting people to the moon if you don't know where they're going to come down, right? Like you have to, if you're going to strap someone to a rocket and give them a big dose of psychedelics, you have to know how and why and when they're coming down and shape that metal. It's no good just heating up the metal and then hoping it turns
Yeah.
into a sword, right? You have to be a skilled blacksmith. And it's that
Yeah.
hammer and anvil skill that I think is like very, very crucial.
Yeah.
And the same would be true. Kind of, we're talking about a different kind of level of analysis here with agent environment dynamics rather than just kind of internal neural dynamics. But I think the same is true. Yeah. I mean, it's fairly easy to imagine ways that the environment can kind of like heat up that relationship and make different outcomes more likely. And also the environment can maybe adapt itself to facilitating certain outcomes as well.
There's something, yeah, because like it sounds to me like those kind of highly weighted expectations, things like, you know, I have no friends, or people don't like me, or something like this, and that becomes obviously like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like in CBT and stuff like that, they try and work on that in terms of reframing, kind of getting, you know, de-weighting them. That's one like talk therapy version, but that there's this like really powerful way to heat up the system where you create an opportunity to renegotiate a lot of them. Obviously, that can drive people insane, and there's like, it's very dangerous. It's not, you know, something you should just jump into and be like, hey, I'm going to heat up my, you know, all
it's
my cognition and see what happens.
Another that Adam Safron uses is, he says like you want to ensure that you're deleting certain kind of beliefs, but you don't want to delete the operating system.
That's, yeah, man, I've done that. Yeah, I've been close to doing that in the laptop, thankfully, but not my own brain. That would be not good. But that is really interesting because I mean, it's a bit of a jump here, but I mean, your work on social media and the warping of the generative model, because that seems to be the same thing, but in the opposite way. It's like you can warp a person's generative model by giving them this feedback in terms of, so like Snapchat surgery is the example. In a lot of your work, and that's like creating those prediction errors. So it's like, there is technological ways that this changes the generative model, and if you had, you know, this cooling down or positive account of a better generative model, that you could use the same kind of process to, you know, for people to have rapid change.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, it's a bit of a leap, but I'm just seeing, does that work for you, and is there a connection?
Yes. I have to think about it quite carefully. I think in the case of social media, what's happening is you're not necessarily, in the case of psychedelics, you're kind of using a direct pharmacological intervention to change, kind of intervene in the generative model. In ways that kind of like you can kind of go a little bit beyond what I'm able to describe. I mean, you're directly acting on like brain chemistry in ways that are kind of allowing for this kind of like change to happen. In the case of technology and the environment, I think it's more like these platforms are so effective at relentlessly delivering quite plausible evidence that they're changing the generative model that way. So it's that they're engaging you in a kind of action perception loop, which is for various reasons so effective at like altering those priors. So you might have like, you might have quite a healthy aspect to your self model where you think, yeah, I look pretty good. Like I look healthy, I'm in good shape, or, whatever. And then you go about the world and that prior holds, fairly stable. If you're then to engage with a certain kind of social media and the features of gamification mean that you find that, you want to keep engaging and you're engaging like quite a lot more than you maybe should be. And the evidence that it's pumping towards you is kind of divergent from reality in a certain way where all you're seeing is people who are probably on steroids or probably photoshopped or at least kind of curated lighting and oil to look incredible. Over time, that could have a kind of sandpaper effect on your prior, where you start to, that distribution gets flattened and you start to think, well, actually, like I don't look that good. And then as you mentioned before, these things can become like self-fulfilling prophecies. You start to sample the world in ways that confirm that belief. You know, you start looking at other people in the gym that you'd not noticed before. You start comparing yourself to other people. You know, you start comparing the weight that you're moving to these people on YouTube that are, you know, all juiced to the gills, as they say. And all of a sudden, your kind of self-model is like very different than it was before. And it's not because it's not so much that the model itself has been heated up and then new evidence has been introduced. It's just that new evidence has been introduced so relentlessly and effectively that your model has not been able to withstand it.
Yeah, okay, that makes more sense. That there's because the pharmacological intervention, because I do I had this Terence McKenna quote in my head that he said that the drugs of the future will be computers and the computers of the future will be drugs. And that there's, you know, that technology is operating pharmacologically, but at a distance. Like it still has, you know, because if you think about behavioral addiction, like it's activating the same stuff as a substance addiction, but it's
I'm inclined
symbolic.
I'm inclined to just go all the way there and say there's no real principle distinction between pharmacology and behavioral, like substance addiction and behavioral addictions. Like it's the same dynamic, it's the same, you know, like it's the same thing is happening in both cases where it's the same neuromodulators, it's the same reward systems, it's the same kind of dysfunctioning learning relationship with the environment. And I think like the distinction between drugs and behaviors, for me at least, almost entirely collapses in terms of what's interesting about addiction. I mean, obviously, there are specifics that need to be taken into account when it comes to certain substances. So, for example, you know, if someone drags you away from playing, you know, if you're cripplingly addicted to World of Warcraft and then somebody takes you away from it, you're not going to die. Whereas quitting alcohol cold turkey for various chemical, physiological reasons, you should be very careful when abstaining from alcohol if you've been drinking heavily for a long time. So there are certain chemical realities that come with substances. But I think when you kind of zoom out and you're trying to understand what addiction actually is, I don't think what's interesting about addiction resides on the level of like the stimulus.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, because you talk about addiction as the opposite of meaning in a sense, like addiction as a kind of short-term pleasure seeking to make up for a lack of meaning, or even like in the case of like video games addiction, like you're improving in the game world, so you're getting good positive feedback. You're great at World of Warcraft, but you got no friends, and you know things aren't progressing in your life.
That's an interesting one. Video games, I think that's what fundamentally defines addiction. I kind of follow Mark Miller's work there, where it's a particular kind of dynamic between an agent and the environment where you get this like collapse in terms of temporality and scope of an agent's concerns, where it just becomes, you know, the consumption of a stimulus which the agent has learned minimizes prediction error for various reasons, and it's vulnerability in other areas makes agents more susceptible to that. You know, if heroin is very, very good at taking away the experience of subject level anguish, say everything else is very hard and taking the drug is very easy, then that's where there's this danger arises. I think the certain behavioral addictions are really interesting. Like, you know, that you mentioned just before you start to break up about video games, and kind of video games provide this arena for kind of like skilled capability sort of interaction with a game world. And something I've always been interested in is the relationship in terms of like prediction error minimization and free energy minimization is how should we think about that in the context of like a virtual arena? It seems like I kind of, again, like going slightly speculative because I've not really thought about it, but I used to there was a paper in my head back in my first year that I wanted to write that was about this kind of dual, the potential for a kind of dual prediction error minimization, where you have an agent is existing in like the quote, you know, a physical world where, you know, the brain is still it's still kind of operating like interoceptive prediction error minimization, like it's still regulating the body's internal states. But the whatever task is taking place, like the actual engagement with the environment, is taking place in a virtual world. So I'm sure there's some interesting stuff to say there, but I think the take home.
But I think that's very relevant to what we're talking about in terms of like that we do have this virtual world that people are trying to deal with. And because it's linked in with the economic, the political, the social so much, it's almost like your success on the platform can lead to success in the real world in a very confusing way. That
One thing I've thought about,
you know,
I've spoken to Dave Chalmers about this in kind of relation to his book, Reality Plus, on kind of like philosophy of virtual reality. I went to a really wonderful summer school that Dave was at, and thinking about meaning in relation to virtual worlds and whether it's possible to find meaning within virtual reality, or whether there's something kind of meaning is like necessarily fundamentally rooted in an offline world. How like aesthetic experiences transfer into, like Dave has this very well argued position where like virtual objects are real objects. Like this, I think it's virtual realism, where there's no real distinction in terms of like the things me and you are interested in this conversation between like virtual objects and non-virtual objects. Whereas my instinct is kind of runs in the opposite direction. I think if
they're 2D anyway, that much so far anyway. I don't know. There seems to be, but that's like, it's so anti-Platonic as well, because obviously Plato has this ontology where the image is the lowest level of reality. It's like, well, it's not pure illusion, but it's an appearance. So it's between reality and illusion. Like the people in the cave live in a world of images pretty much. And so you're supposed to go on this journey out of the cave in order to get to the real forms, which are more like, I don't know, aspects of reality. But it's interesting that the images, because I feel like, I don't know, it's like they're like processed foods or something, like that when we re-represent information in such a way, we lose something. It's not clear what we lose, I don't know, in beaming images around, that it's hard for people in that imagistic world to have a full sense of meaning.
Well,
because it's this kind of,
my academic journey began when I was an undergrad. I majored in English literature, and my primary sort of area of interest was romantic poetry. So I have this like very romantic with a capital R kind of bone in my body, where I like a part of me is really repulsed by kind of notions of finding meaning in virtual digital environments. But at the same time, like I'm aware that it's difficult to give a really cogent, forceful argument for that. It's more difficult than I certainly thought at the beginning. And I think if you even if you take kind of like the John Vervaeke definition of meaning, like it's easy to imagine kind of projects that could unfold in virtual reality that you care about beyond your own existence. There doesn't seem to be any principled reason why we can't find belonging and connectedness in online communities and virtual worlds. I mean, people, like as a matter of fact, people do find and connectedness in online worlds. But I think all of this is worthy of much kind of like deeper, more sustained investigation.
For sure. Definitely. And I suppose because we're kind of making the argument of we're like technological, they're not specifically virtual, but like ambient smart environments are kind of technologically mediated environments in a sense. It's not a like 3D spatial web kind of metaverse thing, which I was interested in, to be honest. I thought that would be better than like a 2D internet, because people actually interact in a more embodied way. Obviously, if it's run by Facebook and there's, embodied 3D ads everywhere, it wouldn't be great. But it's in your brain. I don't. Because I guess the technology mediated thing, I think there could be interventions for meaning that are technologically mediated.
Well, for sure, I mean, even meaning in its I mean, if you're talking about technology more broadly construed, sort of like the design of material space clearly facilitates meaningful practices. Acts of devotion that take place that are scaffolded by specific environments and artifacts and tools. We have all throughout history manufactured material artifacts that are kind of like the basis for devotional spiritual practice. And I don't think there's maybe not too much of a kind of like sharp principle distinction between these things and emerging technologies. I just think we have to be very mindful of like the specifics of this technology in terms of, one of the things I've been interested in recently is the relationship between highly adaptive technology and agency. The ways in which highly adaptive technology can scaffold agency and diminish agency. So I think the specifics are really important. But yeah, I would say as suspicious of a lot of my work has been quite suspicious of technology. Some of it's very optimistic. I would say in principle, I'm quite optimistic about at least kind of like the theoretical possibility of building technological systems that are very good for living meaningful lives, living connected lives, finding belonging, and also allowing us to kind of live wisely as well, like live more mindfully. There's no reason that we can't build these kinds of systems. Whether we will or not is a different question.
Whether the business incentives are there.
Yeah. That's always the shadow that looms over these things, I mean, and it's kind of non-trivial that John has identified some of those aspects as like antithetical to meaning, like capitalism, commerce, advertising, marketing. Like a lot of these things are just kind of like direct opposite of what we talk about when we talk about meaning. We want design strategies that are sort of like, or design philosophies that are sincere and transparent.
Yeah, and also rooted in a philosophy, really, of some, like, it seems to be like, because I think the business incentives drive a lot of it, but also there's a kind of ambiguity about, what are the normative principles of good technology building, of good design, and there's some stuff around it, but like what you've mentioned about adaptive technology and agency is like, there's been so much confusion around agency and questions of free will and control, and that kind of vagueness has really, I think, impacted like building these better technologies. I mean, do you see active inference as like kind of plugging that gap? I know you talked about it as principles of good technology.
Yeah, I think active inference I think active inference, what I would say is I think active inference and predictive processing are very good frameworks for thinking through these problems. I don't, I wouldn't go as far as to say, like active inference is going to solve our issues with technology, but I think if you want to understand, how technology impacts us and our capacity to be well and to experience subjective well-being, how technology might put us in danger of experiencing symptoms of psychopathology, how technology can cause certain kinds of harm, and and then beyond that, how technology might scaffold these like more philosophically weighty notions of meaning and connectedness and purpose. I think predictive processing is a brilliant framework for thinking about these things. And I know on the last episode of the podcast, we talked about why predictive processing is kind of framework that we work through. So yeah, I think it's the right framework. There's nothing about predictive processing itself that's going to be, other than being like a great tool for analysis and exploration. I forget what the question was before that, but
it was, I mean, that it's exactly the point, really, that it provides an account of agency and sentient behavior that can be used normatively.
I think it adds something to philosophy of technology generally. So there are people that within philosophy are working on these kinds of questions. So in particular, Shannon Valler of the University of Edinburgh has a book on technology and the virtues. She has a new book out on AI as well, which I've not yet read. But the book on technology and the virtues is really sort of germane to what we've been talking about in terms of cultivation of character traits, because it's essentially like a virtue ethics grounded approach to living well with technology. I don't think she really says a great deal about like design of technology. It's more about how to live with the technology that we have. Also, there's a really nice little book by Mark Ockelberg. I'm not sure where Mark is now, but it's called Self-Improvement, Technology and Self-Improvement. And it's about moving away from technology that kind of abstracts and gamifies important aspects of our life. And I think this is like predictive processing can add some kind of cognitive science like teeth to this kind of argument. But yeah, I think Mark's absolutely right. I think he identifies like gamification of certain. So, for example, one of the examples he uses is like fitness and physical health, and how the technology we're building kind of turns that into an abstraction of like various data points and measurements and statistics. And it makes me think of when I read that book. I saw Mark give a talk actually, and I spoke to him about. Are you familiar with Goodhart's law?
No, I've never heard of
So
it.
Goodhart's law states that when a measure becomes the target, it ceases to be a good measure.
When a measure becomes the target, it ceases to be a good
So
measure.
you have like a really good example to kind of grasp this is standardized testing in schools. So imagine you're a teacher that's like, you're trying to teach kids like English literature, and in order to measure how well they've learned, you devise a test. But what Goodhart's law states is that over time, it's very likely that the teacher will just simply start to teach the kids how to do well at the test. And so what was originally a kind of like neutral measure becomes the aim. And so the idea then is that it kind of ceases to measure what it was originally intended to measure in the first place. And like a lot of this is happening with a lot of like technology, like kind of Fitbits and various like habit trackers and mood trackers and things like this. And it's one of the questions is, how do you avoid this kind of abstraction?
Yes. And how do you, I mean, because that's like, again, like what should the metrics be is really, I think, what the question, like what's the target, and then how do you actually measure? Because like I've been thinking about autonomy a lot, and like if you could come up with a metric for autonomy, I think based on a lot of active inference, you could have some sort of account. But then it's like, even if you program that, like how people will gamify the system, people will, try and, it becomes, it's almost like, is measuring everything. I don't know.
People love metrics. Like I love
We love metrics, but some things, should they be measured? I don't know.
It might be that's just it might be that in terms of kind of technology that allows us to kind of be well, maybe measuring everything and turning everything into kind of data is a sort of strategic error as far as that's concerned.
You're saying measuring and getting data won't make me happy? There's no way.
Well, my suspicion is not. I mean, I don't know, maybe, but I know him. Yeah, it doesn't. I've kind of done experiments with this where I've used various like trackers and journaling techniques and all kinds of ways of like measuring certain things in my life and tracking things and seeing how things are going and cross-referencing certain streams of data to find trends. And it doesn't seem to be the route to a happy life. Like life. It's not, life is just not an optimization problem in that way, and I think we have to be really imaginative about how technology can kind of probably play a slightly more background role in scaffolding the things we care about while not just turning them into bloodless abstraction.
Well, I think that's a great word to end it on, Ben. Thank you very much for your time. Always fascinating talking to you. I really, really enjoyed that.
Thank you.